I just finished recording this entire tutorial, and then realized that I forgot to actually turn on OBS's recording, so all I had was the audio. Isn't that just dandy? Alright, gamers. So you want to make a PlayStation-style Vertex wiggle. You want those vertices to snap straight to every pixel on the screen, just like an old PlayStation lacking any floating point capabilities? Well, I'm here to show you how to do just that. Now you might be thinking, May, you already showed us how to do that. You did a tutorial on how to do this, and I'm going to say, forget that. I have made a better version of that is 1,000 times more efficient. You can play this one back in real time with no issues. No need to set up your scene to hide it when in viewport mode. I'd first like to actually give a huge thanks to Murmotorius, who pointed out the one thing I was forgetting when I set this up originally. When I first tried this, the Murmo posted this, and that last sentence there, that last push the geometry back in the opposite direction by the raycast hit distance, was the one thing I was missing, because I had tried this method previously, and I just completely missed that option, and I couldn't figure out how to make it work. But now, with Murmo's blessing here, let's get to work on making the perfect PlayStation vertice snapping. I've got the default scene here. We are going to, as usual, abolish the default cube and the sun. I'm going to set our camera to a nice 0, 0, 90, 0, so it's looking straight on. And I'm going to add a mesh monkey as our demonstration object. Set that up right there. I'm going to set my camera to 55. The first thing we need to do is actually add a object to be our snapping effect. In this PlayStation wiggle. And we're going to add a geometry nodes modifier. New geometry node setup. We're going to go over to the geometry nodes view. I'm going to delete this view because I do not need it. It's showing you everything right here. So the first thing we want to set up is actually our inputs for our geometry nodes. So I'm going to go over to the group tab here. I hit N to open that. Oh, I forgot to turn on screen keys. Hold on just a second. We're going to select our object here, and we're going to add in some inputs. We want the X resolution. Set this to a integer. Add another one. This one's going to be our Y resolution. So I'm going to set the defaults to 240 on the Y and 320 on the X. Set both of these to default values. And then we need the camera object. Set this to object. Name this camera. And I'm actually going to select our camera now so I don't forget about it later. We need to add our camera's focal length as a floating value. The camera flip end tells the effect where to stop. We're going to set a collection for what we want to wiggle. So actually we're going to want to move Suzanne here into a collection. I'm just going to name it wiggle. Okay, hide it for now. Here, I'm going to set this as our collection. I'm not going to set it in the default because we imported it on a different scene. We don't want to bring that in. And finally, the floating point value of effect multiplier, so that if we want to not change the X and Y resolution here, but we want to just say, oh, I want this to be twice as apparent, got a multiplier right there. We actually want to create a grid to be the plane where our object's going to snap on the camera. I'm just going to set these to vertices 2, 2. And I'm going to plug this into a transform geometry. As of right now, it is just sitting right here. We want to take the object info of the camera here, set it to relative, to hit Control H to hide everything else on here. We're going to take the location, the rotation, and the scale. If your object disappears when you try to do this, it's because you haven't actually set your camera up in the node inputs, so just make sure to actually set it as your camera. And the reason we're setting all three of these is that way, if we rotate the camera around, it sticks with it. If we move the camera around, it sticks with it. And the scale is more so so that even if we were to, so if I try to move the wiggle object around, it does nothing. If I try to rotate it, it does nothing. And I also wanted to make sure that if I scale, it does nothing. Because if I didn't plug in the scale from here and I did this, it would actually affect our grid. So best to just keep it the flat scale of the camera. Because the camera scale should not be changing. If you're going to try to change your cameras, just adjust your focal length. Now we're going to once again, we're going to take our group input here. We're going to add take our focal length here and divide it by a number, which we'll get to in a second. We're going to put that in a combine XYZ in the Z. That's the direction we want it to move. It's the relative Z axis, which is this way because we rotated it. We're going to take that combined and we're going to plug that into a vector rotate of the camera's rotation. Oops, I forgot. We got to set this to Euler so that that's a rotation value we can actually plug this directly into. And we plug this into a set position node. The position value. Plug our geometry into here. Move it. It's gone. Plug that into offset, not position. So right now it hasn't moved at all, and that's because we need to adjust this value. If we increase it, I realize what's going on. We also forgot to set our focal length. So let's set that to 50, as that's the default, and I'm also going to actually put in the camera clip end at 100 and the effect multiplier at 1. Those should be the defaults as well. Do that here. Clip end is 100. Focal length is 50 because that's the default for cameras. You can set those to whatever you want, but just make sure they're not 0. We're gonna have some issues here. Okay, so object is moving, so we actually want to move it in the negative value. And if you see here, with the side view, our divide value should be set to -36. Okay, hold on. What's our camera set to? Our camera focal length is set to 55. That's what's going on here. Okay, so make sure your focal length here actually matches your camera's focal length, and then it's -36 as the divide value here, and that'll line it up right with the plane. If it seems off, try adjusting this divide value. For some reason, it shouldn't happen, but I've had other projects for some reason that I needed to set that as -32 instead of 36. But just make sure that it just lines right up with the front of your camera. You're going to plug this into a ray cast. That's the target geometry. We want the ray direction first, so we're actually going to take I'm just going to duplicate this object info. I'm going to hide everything except the focal length here. And I'm going to take this, plug it in down here. I'm going to take the location and subtract it from our object's location, position, and that will give us the direction from our Suzanne here towards the camera here, so that we can find the spot where each vertice of Susan intersects with this grid that we've made here. That is going to go in the ray direction here. And the ray length, I'm going to bring this group input over here, unhide, is going to be the camera clip end. That way it's only as far as the camera can see. Now, if we take this, hit position, build into a set position, the position, we want to take, we need to import the actual objects that we're trying to move. We're going to grab our input again here, unhide it. We want the collection into a collection info. node here. Again, set to relative, otherwise it'll be everything at the position of the wiggle object. We don't want that. Hide that with Control H. And then we're going to realize our instances so they become actual geometry we can interact with. We're going to triangulate this as PlayStation models were. Um, if you were already working with triangulated models, you don't have to worry about this. But I always set it to one of the two fixed items here, because if we had our model set on an armature that was bending and the distances between each was changing, then the shortest diagonal and longest diagonal would change, beauty might change. So just set it to one of the fixed options here. And this is going to be the object in this position here. Move these over here to be a little cleaner. Now I'm have Shift, Alt, click that. That sets it to our output. And you can see it is now flattening our Suzanne directly on the screen. But if you'll see, if it goes outside of the space of that grid, it starts freaking out. So that's why we want to go back here, and we're actually going to set that grid to be super, super big. I'm going to set it to like 10,000. So don't have to worry about this going outside of that direct range. We go to our camera view. We've got a flattened version of Suzanne perfectly lined up with where it hits the camera. So what do we do with that? Well, I'm going to move this down because we're going to need a lot of room. I'm going to grab, I just keep duplicating this. I'm just going to duplicate this, scale them together a little bit. The focal length. Okay. So we got that camera location rotation again. So we want to take the location here and subtract that from the position we're at right now. Set that as our position. That moves it so that no matter where, if I take the object and the camera here and I move them together, it keeps the object on the relative to the origin of the world. It doesn't actually move with everything else. That's just a handy little thing. It'll make our lives easier down the line for snapping things. And then we also want to cancel out the rotation, because right now if I rotate these, rotating around the origin, which will not help with our snapping. So we're going to take this and plug it into a vector rotate again. Vector, set this to Euler once again. We're going to take the rotation from this and we're going to invert it. That will cancel out, plug it in to our position here. That will cancel out the rotations of the camera to keep it on flat on the XY, flat relative to the XY plane. Now if we rotate this around, move it around, nothing changes. It just stays put exactly where it is, which is what we want. It's down more. Now we got to find the size of a pixel based on our X and Y resolutions here. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to add in our input again. H to unhide everything. Take our X and we're going to divide it by our effect multiplier, because if we have double the effect, we want our pixels to be half as big. I'm going to do the same thing with the Y resolution by the multiplier. Hide this because that's all we need from this. And then we take this, I'm just going to duplicate it. We want to divide 1 by our value, and that gives us the size of a pixel on a 1x1 grid. Hey, it's May from the future. I realized that I messed something up in that last step. Just the way I had set it before, when changing the aspect ratio, it would stretch the grid instead of adjusting it. So using this setup instead of the previous setup, you only need one output. It takes the maximum pixel size and just sets that as the size of the grid, and everything will actually conform to that. And I tested and verified that this actually works. So any steps where you see me taking from the X and Y part going forward, just know that they're both being pulled from this one setup instead of the previous setup that I just showed you how to do. Here comes the fun part, snapping everything. So we're going to take our position here. Our position, we're going to separate XYZ values. And then the way that snapping works, if we have a grid like this, pretend this is a nice even grid and not all over the place. If our vertice is right here on this grid and we say snap to this grid, it'll actually snap to the bottom corner because snap always rounds down on its grids. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to add half of a pixel width to it so that it'll actually end up here and it'll snap down to this. And that will even out the rounding feature. We're going to take this and we're going to plug it into a multiply add. This is going to be the addend. Or no, this is the, yes. We want to multiply this pixel width by half and add it to position on the X. Do the same thing here with the Y. Okay. And then we want to plug this into a combined XYZ. X, Y, Z doesn't matter. Snap it. And the increment is going to be back down to these pixel size values here. We're going to do another combine XYZ, the X, and the Y. I'm just going to set this to 1. It doesn't really matter. Plug that in here, and that is telling it to snap on that grid. And we just need to do another separate XYZ here. Plug this into a combine XYZ so we can take the X and the Y from here, but the original Z value is going to come over here. We plug this, move this way down here. We plug this into the position. And I'm just going to make our resolution something like 16. It's noticeable. Now you can see that it's still at that position, but it is snapping everything to a 16 by 16 camera space grid. So we need to move it back to the camera. Opposite order of before, we're going to, since before we took the rotate after the subtract, you set it here, we're going to rotate back first and then add it back. So we're going to plug this into a vector rotate. Once again, I'm going to grab this camera object. We use that a lot, as you've noticed. And we're going to plug this rotation into the, again, set to Euler, forgetting that. We're going to plug this rotation into here, and we're not going to invert it this time. Plug that back in here. Now our object is lined up again, so the rotations aren't canceled out. And then we add the location back. Plug that into the position, and now it's back on the camera. See, it is snapping to that grid. It's not quite 16 by 16 here because our camera is actually wider. You want the aspect ratios to match up if you're actually trying to match to that grid. So if you're set to a 16:9 aspect ratio, maybe set your grid to 16:9, you know? It's got to line up mathematically, but it is in fact snapping all of the vertices along this path. And if we set it to 320 by 240, it's closer, but it is still snapping on a very small increment space. Okay, now we want to move it back. This is the part that I was missing from before. So we need to take our version from before we rotated it, or before we added back the location of the camera, normalize it, and multiply it by way back over here, hit distance. And just reroute here. So I can move that way down here, plug that into the bottom value, and that tells it the direction it needs to move and the distance to move it. Then we plug that into plug that into an offset. It moves our object back. See, it's wiggly version. It's right on top, so it's a little hard to see. I set this to, once again, a 16 by 16 grid, and I hide real Suzanne. See, it is now very much gridified. And there is a small issue here that still exists, and that is if our object goes behind that plane, it starts acting a little funky. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate this by rotating our camera around. As soon as it passes it's Suzanne here gets a little busted. And if we continue our rotation, it actually ends up flipping her around upside down on this side. We don't want that, I don't think. I don't want that. Maybe you do. So we need to find a way to tell it, to figure out whether or not it's behind this camera spot. And the way I found to do that is actually go back over here. We're going to add another raycast. We're going to take our geometry from before we set it to the front of the camera, from back when it was over here, into the target. We're going to take the same ray direction and camera clip end, and then we need to take the hit distance here, and we go less than this hit distance. So that means if it's closer to this than it is to that, I'm going to take that, and we're going to plug that into a reroute, so we can drag it way down over here. This is going to be in the selection, so that now, if I were to take Suzanne, if I move our Suzanne closer to the camera, closer to the camera, closer to the camera, eventually it passes that threshold, and instead it just turns off the effect on any object that's too close. Now, normally you wouldn't be going through the camera, but if I say rotated this on the Z, once it passes, it doesn't flip around, it just stops being affected by PlayStation Wiggle. And that's it. You now have the effect done. This is an overview of our mess, and here's the effect in action on a little animation I made. Just so you can see it demonstrated at actual PlayStation scale. Let me know what you guys think. Hopefully this was very understandable and followable. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you again next time.